Will you be ready for the new retirement? Well, here to talk with me about that is Lorna Sabia from Bank of America. Lorna, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Recently, you partook in a webinar where you had a good many folks, Ken Dykewald, Saria Kalari, talking about the new retirement. And first of all, let's start with an overview of what you discussed and some of the highlights from that.
Yeah, I think we talked about a lot as it relates to how the pandemic is sort of reshaping everyone's views on the topic of retirement and everyone's preparedness on the topic of retirement, whether you're approaching retirement around the corner, whether it's something further away, or whether you're actually in retirement as well. And then we double clicked on the topic of women in particular. Their sort of life stages, their experiences are different in many ways versus men. And so how we prepare and how we think about that should be different as well. So those are some high level views that we sort of dug into.
Right. So one of the more shocking facts that was revealed was the notion that there's $1 million difference between men and women in terms of their, their wealth by the time they reach retirement.
That's right. And so, oftentimes I think we discuss pay inequity, right? So what's the pay gap? And whether you subscribe to the fact that women earn 82 cents on the dollar or 76 cents, I can tell you in my lifetime, it hasn't changed dramatically that much, but that's just a moment in time. So when you think of a woman's, life path, it has sometimes interruptions in it too. So if we start with a difference in pay, and for the topic of caregivers, right now, if you look inside the US, 2/3 of our caregivers are non-professional caregivers are in fact women. And so, although there's some hope in our newest generations to sort of even that out a little bit, the reality now is the topic of caregiving is a female topic. And so when you think about, women taking themselves out of the workforce, sometimes to raise their own children, or in addition, provide care for other family members or those that they love, there's disruption then into not only earning income, it's the opportunity to save against that income and invest as well. Think about topics like 401k plans from your employer. If you're no longer employed, you don't have the opportunity for that savings or the match for most companies that offer that for their employees. So if you were to draw that line over a woman's lifetime, that's where it actually versus a male, their counterpart, it turns into on average $1 million in wealth gap. And I worry about that. We live 5 years longer on average versus men. So that longevity aspect could be used to our advantage. But if we don't start earlier enough, it actually becomes more of a challenge because you don't want to have a smaller nest egg for a longer life.
Right. So in the webinar, I noticed that Saria mentioned that step one for women would be to get comfortable investing earlier, that there was a certain percent of women who were wish they had invested more earlier.
That's right. We did a survey and a research study on the topic of women in investing. And what was an aha for me by far was the fact, what you just said, regardless of ethnicity as well. The number one financial regret that women had was that they did not start to invest sooner. And so that's important for us to really truly understand and appreciate. But the second part that was an aha for me as well is in the same exact survey, sampling the same, individuals, they would actually say, it was about 61% of the women that were surveyed would actually say that they would prefer to speak about their own death versus investing. And so I always say it's very difficult for those two things to coexist, but we have to be aware of them. And that's important because women make really good investors just like men do. And so that confidence has to catch up and we have to start a little bit earlier.
Right. Among the steps that were mentioned, step two was the notion that that a woman's portfolio needs to reflect their risk propensity. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what we're really getting to is the allocation to equities. And so risk tolerance in general, most women carry a lower risk tolerance. Therefore, oftentimes we find that their portfolios are lesser weighted to equities. And when you think about the topic of retirement, oftentimes it's a long-term investment. And so being properly allocated to equities is actually a key component to having the nest egg that you desire and that you need for a longer life. And so we had Chris Heisey, who is our chief investment officer, talk a little bit about the allocation to asset classes and getting that right is equally important to start to invest.
Right. Step three was this notion of, you mentioned a second ago, contributing to a retirement plan. Do you find that women generally aren't doing that when they have access to an employer-sponsored plan at work?
They're doing it. They're just doing it at a lesser pace versus their male counterparts. They trail by about 3 points. The good news, again, I'm a Gen Xer, so I can say this. When I look at the Gen Z and the millennial populations and the generations, they're getting it more right. So those cohorts, you see sort of, men and women actually participating at, more closely aligned. So we have sort of a participation rate, and then you have a contribution rate as well. Women also trail men as it relates to contribution rate. So that net oftentimes finds ourselves where the total amount in those types of, retirement plans are actually less for women versus men. All of those things are really important. So you want to ensure that you are participating in the benefit programs that you have at the company and participating at a participation or a contribution rate that makes sense for your long-term goals.
Right. And if possible, to make sure that you're contributing enough to get the full employer match, if that's appropriate.
That's exactly right. Free money.
Right. So you mentioned this a second ago. Step 4 in the webinar had to do with having a family conversation about caregiving and developing a logical plan. Do you care to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say that. Sometimes those are the most emotionally driven conversations. And in my experience, actually in my own family, oftentimes it's helped us when we had sort of a third party person that we trusted to help have the conversation with us, because I found that it took the emotion out of the conversation. I think the more that we can talk about, what does everybody, expect or want to see happen? And are we prepared to actually deliver that? It's easy to say, I want to care for a family member at my home. Are you prepared to do that? By the way, both within your home, but financially to do that as well. And so I think having those conversations as early as you can makes it easier to check in if things change over time. I noticed just in my own family having this conversation with my mom, she has certain desires of how she wants to be cared for just in case, right? And we talk about those topics, and we've gone through little things like knee surgeries and rehabilitation for those things. Although you can say that's easier for somebody like me who was traveling all the time, it actually was a big thing. And I had to think about it and plan for it. And so the more that you can just be thoughtful and understanding and have a view of how you would like it to work, the better you would be prepared financially and frankly, emotionally too, to be in a position to deliver on that.
Yeah. Talk, if you don't mind, about the role that financial advisors can play with respect to that conversation. Is there a role for them?
Yeah, I think there is. In fact, in my own experience, that's exactly who that person was that joined us at the table to have these types of topics. Like I said, to have somebody who knows you well enough, but is not a family member, allows you to sort of remove the emotion. So our financial advisors oftentimes get involved with all of those, I'm going to call those planning type of conversations, whether it's planning for the topic of caregiving or planning around your estate plan. If I look at clients, particularly because of the pandemic, it's not just COVID, it's also the new administration. We have many more clients reviewing their estate plans right now to make sure they're up to date on their wishes. And we sort of, in a weird way, we can't keep up with the demand because everybody's doing it. In fact, I did it again. And so a financial advisor plays a really important role in not only that having the conversation the right way, but being in a position to execute the plan based on your desires.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that you haven't touched upon that you'd like to make mention of, or anything that you've already mentioned that you want to reemphasize?
Yeah, I just think that, first of all, thank you for having this conversation. We're talking about, topics that hit women differently as well. So, we're all in this together. And I think the more that we all talk about it, men and women, we're going to be in a better position overall to help each other. So I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Well, Laura, I greatly too appreciate you being here with us and sharing your knowledge and wisdom about this topic.